to our Green Living Workshop. We're really excited that you've joined us on this. It's a lovely November evening, so thanks for joining us. So my name is Ginny, and I'm the Environment and Sustainability Coordinator here with the Town of Okotoks. Our Green Living Workshops, they take place once a month with the exception of December, because everyone's at Christmas parties all December long and they don't want to come. Every month we also introduce a topic that will help us as residents of Okotoks to live more in balance with the ecosystem that's around us. So tonight, we're going to learn all about Alberta's amazing native bee species. So our presenter tonight is Alexandria Farmer. She is a pollination ecologist and professor at Mount Royal University. So we will be taking questions throughout the presentation after each slide or at the end of the presentation just as the questions come up. If you can put your questions please in the Q&A option that's at the bottom of your screen and type in your question there. We'll do our best to get to all of them tonight. Any that we don't get to, we'll answer them via email. So thank you again, Lexi, for joining us this evening, and please go ahead and teach us all about our lovely Albertan bees.
Well, thanks for having me. I have to laugh when you call me a professor, though, especially when my name's Farmer. Anyway, and I'd love to be able to tell you about all about Alberta's native bees that I know about a drop in the bucket, right? And that's kind of the way it goes with entomology is you learn your species and that's as good as it gets. But I'll do my best. So tonight's talk, I take a few different spins here. I kind of combine what the messaging I really want to get out and also why I'm so passionate about it. And my end goal is that I can really try and make you guys all passionate about native bees as well. So I'm calling this talk Bring Back the Bees, and I'm kind of poking the idea that whenever people hear the word bees, they think of honeybees, and so this is my Cheerios bee. So I want to talk about the other bees, the native bees, and especially now that Okotoks is becoming a bee city, congratulations, but I want to make sure that we steer you guys in the right direction because you're already one of the last strongholds and you have a great opportunity to literally lead by example and show the other communities around you that you're actually really doing the right thing by bees, right? So, so where my journey began, and I'll keep this brief because you might not care, is that I started studying bees. Well, I loved them my whole life, but for some stupid reason, back in 2009, when I had 3 small children, I decided to go back to grad school. And about the only thing I could, that I was so passionate about that I could actually study like this was, bumblebees, because they're just always amazing, the coolest animal on the planet. And so my research is just right there in that slide. It explains everything. I looked at how clear-cut logging in the landscape affected these native bumblebee populations. And so I looked at how it affected their numbers and their distributions across an increasingly disturbed ecosystem. So this is all along the eastern slopes of Kananaskis country. In doing that, in the Ralph Carter Mary Reid lab at the University of Calgary, I met the wonderful Megan Evans, and she was studying bumblebees, native bees in prairie settings with agriculture. And she was just the best person I ever met. And so one of the things that we both would comment on all the time was that whenever we mentioned to people that we studied bees, as soon as we said, the bee word, it was like, oh, honey, oh, you study honeybees. I love honeybees. Oh, I want to get honeybees. My uncle had honeybees, and so on and so on. And we realized that there's a bit of a disconnect and a whole lot of lack of knowledge and information about native bees and what are wild bees compared to managed bees. And so that sort of started our drive, and we began creating hundreds and hundreds of bumblebee nesting boxes, only really for the reason to just raise awareness about native bees. It really wasn't even about conservation at that point. It was really just about, what can we do that will actually catch people's eye and get them to actually think, hey, there's something, besides these honeybees. And that's sort of where the whole thing began. And then Megan, I can't take any credit, just sort of boom, she really spearheaded getting the Alberta Native Bee Council founded, and so away we went. And so it's been an amazing journey. And so one of our biggest goals for setting up the Alberta Native Bee Council And so I speak to you tonight as a representative of Mount Royal University, but as far as that goes, was to dispel a lot of misinformation. Now these are all tongue-in-cheek that I present here. So the yellow jackets for your bees. This is obviously not a real thing, but it made me laugh. So that's misinformation. But certainly I'll bet everyone here has heard the idea that the laws of physics declare that a bumblebee cannot fly, when in fact bumblebees are actually one of the most efficient flying animals on the planet, and they can actually get photo radar tickets moving through playgrounds. So, probably not, but they are incredible flyers. They also have incredible visual acuity, so that even while they're flying super fast, they actually can zone in on, whoa, wait, we're gonna have to go back and check out that patch because there looks to be some good forage there. So I'm sure you've seen this. Social media is the bane of a native bee existence. So if the bee disappeared off the face of the earth, man would only have 4 years left to live. And I asked Albert Einstein about this, and he said, well, I never said that. So obviously he didn't. And I mean, in this picture, you can see that we have this glorious, glorious honeybee. And I want to tell you right off the bat that I do love honeybees. So I've had people ask me, how come you don't like honeybees? And that's not at all the case. If anything, I feel like I'm advocating for them in this talk tonight. So, I love the Baby Bumblebee song. I have a super cute video of my daughter singing this. And but when you actually think about what the Baby Bumblebee is, it's not that, it's actually this. So, I don't think many little kids are picking up baby bumblebees if they knew, right? I'm just poking fun at this, right? And then, of course, the Bee Movie. That was just, that made me mad because by the time this came out, I actually really had a good understanding of bees. And here we have this male bee with his stinger that he had to replace with a olive sword. And in fact, it's only females that can sting, and it's only honeybees that die when they sting you because they become eviscerated. That's their intestines that get ripped out as their barbed stinger stays inside, whereas most of your native bees, they can sting you all they want. They're more like little ice picks, and they never die. So, there's just, and it's the females that are doing all this work. Males can't even sting. So, that's the sting I got. And that wasn't even from a bumblebee or a honeybee. That was actually from a sweat bee that got stuck on me. So, it's kind of that's a picture of her. So, but I leaned on her, and so she got me. But normally they don't sting you. It's only if you threaten them that they're actually going to come after you. So, and of course, so many things like this, and all the things you can do to save the bees, and plant bee-friendly flowers, and weeds are a good thing, and don't use chemicals, and everything here is true except for maybe the number 4. And of course, number 7, learn how to be a beekeeper. And in fact, I would argue that this is actually one of the more harmful bits of information that are out there currently, and I'll explain why as we go along. So bear with me, right? But overall, and if you follow the media or if you follow the information that's out there, there is this very skewed perception of what save the bees even means. And so they'll show, things about pesticides and neonics and then the dead honeybee curled up, when in fact native bees are far more susceptible to neonic poisoning than our honeybees. So who really does need saving, right? Honeybee keeping does seem incredibly, I've been wooed by the seductive beauty and docile nature of honeybees. I can't lie. I've had them land all over me, and I've rescued them from ponds and things, and they are lovely. But what we're seeing is this exponential growth in honeybee keeping, and everybody's selling them. So you can literally go into Costco and buy, thousands of bees, and people won't even know what to do with them. I remember being on a Peavey Mart site, and they announced that they would have their truck with their load of honeybees in, and the comments were things like, cool, man, I gotta get one. What do I do with it? And I've driven by homes in Black Diamond where there'll be just this lawn, this desolate lawn with a box just sitting out front, and they have to go somewhere to find food. And it is very concerning. And this is something that we refer to as bee washing then. And so you'll see all sorts of initiatives where, we're going to have rooftop beekeeping. Safeway has recently started their campaign about having rooftop beekeeping, and some of the hotels in Calgary. And it's really marketed as this, it's as a green initiative, as something that's actually doing something for the betterment of the environment. There is no question that honeybees are a necessity in agriculture, but are they necessary in natural settings, and are they necessary in public settings, urban settings? I would argue that they aren't. So. We do have a long history with beekeeping in Canada. So back in 1924, we had around 22,000 beekeepers in the country. This was spread across all of Canada. There was around 280,000 colonies nationwide. And so that produced about 17 million pounds of honey, which sounds like a lot to me. And 2/3 of that was coming out of Ontario. In the 40s, beekeeping actually started to take off, and there was around 27,000 beekeepers. And this actually really aided in the war effort, because honey was a good replacement for the depleted sugar supplies, and waxes were used with ammunition belts. So it was serving that way. By the 60s, beekeeping moved to the west, and we saw a huge uptake within our prairie provinces. And before long, it was actually the prairie provinces that were making double what Ontario was making. So, and that was all well and good until about 1989. And that's when we had the massive Varroa mite outbreak, right? And so if you think about historically, other examples of when you have massive monocultures and how things can go wrong, this is an example of that. So you had these massive die-offs. And this led to a huge decline in beekeepers, especially within the hobbyists, the ones where it wasn't a livelihood per se. But, again, it started to creep its way back up, and certainly for canola production, beekeeping was a huge part of that. So by 2014, over $7 billion of sales came from canola pollination, and over $2.5 billion from soybean, hundreds of millions for blueberry and apple and so on. So but one thing to note is that by 2015, BC and Ontario accounted for 57% of beekeepers, but the rest were just in our little prairie provinces, and we were yielding 78 million pounds of honey to those other provinces, 13 million. So even though we had less the beekeepers, we were producing 6 times more honey. So that's significant. So by 2016, we had over 316 honeybee colonies just in Alberta. So remember, when we started this, we had 280 across the entire country. And keep in mind what's happening to the landscape, right? As our populations are increasing and so on. Currently, it's estimated that there's actually over 350,000 colonies. So that's an increase of well over 50% since 1987. Between 2015 and 2016, the number of beekeepers rose from 1,390. And especially, you want to note that we had exponential growth of urban honeybee keeping. So that's not part of agriculture. That's just within our towns and our cities. And there's a lot of evidence that with agricultural intensification, our urban habitats actually become super important, almost like lifeboats of biodiversity. With all our, manicure, or our lovely gardens that we produce in our green spaces, they become great places for native bee species that have been displaced to come and hang out. So what is the problem with all of this? Because we do love our honeybees, but they are not the center of the bee universe. And so you have to think about all these other bees that we have within Alberta, within Canada, within North America. So across the planet, we have well over 20,000 species of bees, right? And most people, if you ask someone to, when we think of bees, I'll get, honeybees and bumblebees, and there's more an awareness of leafcutter bees and mason bees, but sadly that comes from the fact that you can buy these things commercially. But after that, the knowledge, maybe sweat bees get mentioned, but when you think that you have, and 20,000 is an incredibly modest estimate. There's a lot of bees that aren't being thought about, and I don't know if I could name that many. So there's over 4,000 bees in North America, and again, most of those we just don't know very much at all about their numbers. Here in Canada, we have well over 800, and in Alberta, we have well over 300. So I think last count I saw was around 327 described species of native bee in Alberta. But I know, talking with Lincoln Best, who is the best bee taxonomist on the planet, as far as I know, he says he discovers new species almost monthly. So, I mean, it really begs to, how many species are actually out there.
I have a question for you, Lexi.
Yes.
When we go further north, so let's say in, the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, do you know how many bee species are there?
I don't, but that's a good question. As far as the distribution, like the abundance of diversity, I guess, or are you more interested in diversity, I guess? That's a good question, because you think about the tundra, and it would be easy to do some digging and find that out for you.
It's no big deal. I just thought, hey, how many bees are up there? It's cold. How do they do up there?
What's
That's a good question. I don't know, because we're just talking about Alberta, and I thought, okay, so the further north you go, I know there's a lot more probably down south because it's warmer. And I just wonder which of them, up there would be kind of, they'd be the hardiest species out there, right, to live in that kind of
and that gets into why our native bees are so important, and a big part of that is adaptation. So being able to sustain themselves. I mean, look at bumblebees. Part of what makes them the best pollinator in arboreal habitats is that they can, they have their great big robust bodies. They're super hairy. Functionally, they're actually endothermic, which you can't say of any other insect. So they actually just vibrate their flight muscles and generate this heat that warms them to incredible temperatures. So that's a good question. I'd have to look that up. Way to go. Now you stumped me.
Sorry, answer. I'll encourage anyone else out there who's listening to
don't listen.
Bring in your questions. Bring on the questions. All right, I'll let you keep going.
I told you I know a drop in the bucket. So we do have over 300 species of bee right here in Alberta, and I wish I had looked this up just recently, but it's well over 200 just in Calgary alone, and I don't believe they've been quantified in places like Okotoks or where I am out in Turner Valley and such, but that's an incredible amount of diversity. The life cycle of these species, most of them are solitary, so it's not like the old cartoon images you see where you've got this big honeycombs in the tree and the bear comes and whacks it and takes all the honey. Most of them are underground. And so that should, if you're thinking about creating habitat to help native bees, you have to actually look down at what your feet are standing on as opposed to looking up. There's very few instances. I mean, for myself, where have I found colonies? Birdhouses, if I was looking up. So if I had old birdhouses, bumblebees will take these over. Bumblebees are our social insect within Alberta, and these are the colony forming insects. But 98% of our species are these solitary bees, and solitary is a bit of a what's the word? The word is incorrect. The fact that they don't produce queens and workers and drones and so on is why they're referred to as solitary. So you have a female bee that emerges. She goes out and she eats whatever. She gets her nectar and her pollen. She's been fertilized by a male. And then she lays her eggs. So whether or not she provides sperm and fertilizes these eggs will determine the sex of those. And then she provisions each of these little cells that she's got here with nectar and pollen, maybe seals those up and carries on collecting to lay down more eggs. And that's just, one example. So we could also see things like stem nesters that you see down below here. And so cases like that, or if you think about those solitary bee boxes people are buying with all the tubes, so mason bees and leafcutter bees and things, they'll, again, lay their eggs, put in nectar pollen. They make their little, I have footage of this on the Bee Council page, but where they cut these perfect circles of leaf tissue and they roll them up like little sleeping bags and just fly away so quickly. But then they separate each of their little chambers with those. So the reason they're called solitary is because they don't produce these other workers to help them out, and they just leave these things. They don't sort of take care of the developing larvae the way you see with a colony forming bee, where you'd have these worker bees that are sort of vibrating all over, generating heat, providing provisions and guarding and protecting these developing bees, which are inside all of these little wax balls. So, so you can actually see too in this bottom picture that, and I took this picture of one of the first colonies I ever harvested, that some of these little wax balls have honey in them. So a lot of people don't know that bumblebees actually do produce honey, and it's probably the most delicious honey you'll ever taste, but they don't produce it near large enough quantities that you or I could ever enjoy. So because they're an annual species, as opposed to honeybees, which go on and on, that produce massive amounts of honey, a bumblebee will produce enough honey to get through a few days, kind of thing. And so it's a very limited supply, right? I'll show you an interesting video I took, though. And this was at the Weaselhead. Hopefully I have the sound off good. And so what you see here, it's probably not super evident at first, but you're seeing actually dozens and dozens of bees flying around. So those aren't flies, that's all bees. And so there's an aggregation of these solitary nests. And so even though we refer to them as solitary, these bees are nesting in aggregation to get protection from each other, so that some of them can go out and forage while other ones are staying back and protecting the developing young to prevent predators from moving in, like parasitic wasps and so on. So that's a very social behavior, despite being referred to as solitary bees. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Cut in here for 2 seconds. I don't think we could see the video that you showed because that part of your screen wasn't showing.
Can you see it or no?
No, we can't see the video.
Really? I don't understand.
You might have to like reshare the screen.
Stop sharing, and then I'm going to share screen again. Oh, I see, because it's on a, oh, that's annoying, hey? Okay. Can you see it now?
Yeah, that's great.
I'm sorry. Does that mean maybe I shouldn't be showing you all these videos? Oh, go back. There we go. There. Oh, so can you see them now? They're all flying around here, and there's little holes. You can just can't move them, make them out because they move around too quickly. But,
that's cool.
Yeah, those are all solitary bees. But again, they're nesting in aggregations. So things like coleted bees or plasterer bees and lining bees, they're all hanging out together to look after each other. So, right.
That's really cool.
Yeah. I have to go back to my, hopefully I get to, oh, this is gonna be weird. So can you guys hear me? Everything got very quiet.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. All right. So, that was just to give you a bit of a background. I'll show you more pictures of bumblebees because that's, again, where I sort of specialize. So, and we know that there's been huge declines in invertebrates in general. So I'll sort of start big scale, but we know there's a number of studies that have shown that we've seen massive declines in our invertebrate populations, our insect populations. And anecdotally, I lived in northern Alberta for most of my childhood, but all my grandparents and such were out here. And so we would drive across Alberta several times a summer. And most of the time you couldn't make it from one town to the next without stopping to use the big heavy window washers to get all the bug guts off your windows because you'd be blinded. And now I can't think of a time when I've ever had to use my windshields wipers for removing insects. And I drive all over rural Alberta as a teaching and as a hockey mom. So, and it's in the summer too. So more recently, the IUCN, a study by the IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature. So this is global scale, has found that there's actually been a 28% 28% decline, or 28% of our North American bumblebee species. So just focused on them because there's a lot more research on them than most of the other native bee species. But it's been observed that there's been this huge decline in about 28% of them, such that they may actually be at risk of extinction. So, and there's been others, studies that have supported this, so by Sheila Kola and so on. So it's concerning, and bumblebees are kind of our big sexy megafauna of the bee world, of the native bee world. It's easier to study them because they're big and form colonies, but there's far less information on our solitary bees. And when you think about 3,800 species or 4,000 species of bees, that's a lot of species that we don't know about, right? So one of the biggest smoking guns would certainly be habitat loss or degradation. So loss doesn't necessarily mean a meteor landed on it. Loss can be where it's no longer functionally available to our native species. And so agricultural intensification is huge with that regard, but certainly urban sprawl. So as we see our cities kind of moving, spreading out, if we look at our landscape here in Alberta, you can see that there's this massive decline and predicted, by 2060. So if you think where Highway 22 is, that's a huge amount of urban sprawl. And so a huge loss of these little patches of what's left of our sort of natural habitat. And I don't just mean these natural sort of patches of trees, but I'm also talking about native prairie grassland, of which we only have about 5% left in Alberta, and pretty much every species that's tied to our native prairie grassland is also in danger, critically endangered and so on. So what we do know from some studies, they've shown that this, homogenized landscape through agriculture, you have less forage, and it's for these very brief periods of time. So you have these massive flowering crops, but it's for this brief window. And of course, it's absolutely flooded with commercially reared bees. And so some studies have shown a decline in bumblebee densities, greater than 80% in response to that. And then with that would also come a decline in foraging efficiency. And again, that study focused on the big bumblebees and things that are more easily studied, but bumblebees have incredible foraging distances that they can acquire, whereas our solitary bees and certainly the smaller species, ones that we call those sort of doorstep species that can't physically go further, what does that do to them, right? And so we see that when they're not foraging efficiently, they have these longer foraging flights, which means that they're not bringing back as much resources to the offspring. They also become more susceptible to predators like parasitic wasps and so on. So it's certainly shown to have some big effects, right? Competition, if you're thinking about the resources that a honeybee colony uses, Kane and Trepidino summarized this. They estimated that one colony of honeybees can consume enough resources that would actually have sustained over 100,000 solitary bees. And so I know Dave Goulson, a very famous bombologist out of the UK, actually quantified this in terms of pollen and nectar. And so anywhere from 20 to 130 pounds of pollen in a season by one colony, or up to 900 pounds of nectar. So just the little sugar that's in a flower, just by one colony. If you put that into a more relevant scale, so actual numbers, when you're driving around southern Alberta and you see the big blocks of hives, typical 40 hives in a wildland, that would consume enough pollen that would have actually fed over 4 million native bees. So that's no small drop in the bucket. And when you look at our landscape, especially when you have factors that sort of exacerbate that, like recent droughts and things. When I drive around, I take Tongue Creek or heading up 22, and I see all these boxes, and I look around and it's just grass, like there's just no flowers. And so these honeybees, where are they going to get their food? And it's into the natural areas, and it's into your gardens that you put out, I would arguably, for other pollinators. There's also evidence of spread of disease. So there's a lot of evidence for pathogen spillover. We think of flowers as being these lovely things, but for a bee, they're actually full of bacteria and viruses and infections. Are almost like toilet bowls because they all come in, it's all wet and sugary water, which is a perfect breeding ground for whatever, right? So RNA viruses and varroa mites, deformed wing virus, which comes from that. And I actually had a bee in my yard this summer that I'm wondering if that's what it had. But there's been numerous studies that have actually talked about and have found that there's this correlation between commercially reared bees, their abundance, and then of course the associated pathogen spillover. We do have an Alberta Bee Act, which sounded good at first, except that it's actually only dealing with these non-native honeybees. And so there's actually nothing to do with native bees in it. And so this Bee Act monitors any honeybee populations that are brought in, and you have to report on how your bees are doing. There's usually die-off every year, and this can be 15%. More recently, I've read up to 40%. However, even when you have numbers that high, beekeepers are splitting colonies and constantly replacing these numbers. So, to be clear, there is no threat of these honeybees, these agricultural domesticated organisms of decline. So when they actually look at reporting the causes for their mortality, certainly when they have poor queens, varroa mites are still a problem. Nosema species, which are a fungal infection, and they have different sort of virulence depending on the species of bee. And then, of course, starvation. And that's kind of a sticking point for me because these are bees that are being monitored heavily. And the fact that one of the causes of their mortality is starvation, that's a bit of a concerning thing when we're not monitoring our own species. So we don't have any kind of monitoring program that's similar to this. Actually, that's kind of a lie because the Alberta Native Bee Council has a bee monitoring program in Medicine Hat that Megan Evans has taken over, and I think she'll have some reports on that soon. Okay. So why all this fuss over our native species? People have joked to me, well, it's survival of the fittest. So if they don't survive and honeybees win, then they're obviously better adapted, and that's simply not the case. We need biodiversity. The more biodiversity you have within an ecosystem, this is what gives it its resilience to sustain itself through things like disease outbreak, catastrophes, and so on. And so when we see a decline in biodiversity, the entire health of the ecosystem is severely impacted. Everything is connected to everything else. So if you have climate change and massive floods and rodent populations die off, you've now lost a crucial nesting site for many of our native species. So it's all connected. Right? Biggest thing is that our native bees are just better adapted to pollinate here. And so, as Ginny and I were talking about, bumblebees are a great example because they're big and hairy and they can vibrate their muscles and do all these fabulous things. But certainly we have other smaller native bees that still carry on and do quite well. They also have a huge variety of tongue lengths. So if you think about having these monocultures of honeybees where they just have this tongue length, but with our native bees, you've got all different tongue lengths. And that's important because we have a huge diversity of native flowering plants as well. And we've seen studies where when native bee diversity declines, so does the diversity of native plants found there. There's also a lot of evidence that honeybees will actually preferentially forage on invasive plant species, and this can actually proliferate their populations, which again outcompete our native species. So that's another way that this can actually cause declines in native plant species. And of course, the very fact that they are free and most times more efficient at pollinating than commercially reared bees. And I speak a lot about honeybees, but I'm also talking about commercially reared bumblebees. So there has been massive declines in some bee species caused by commercially reared bumblebees and spillover of diseases from them as well. So. A locally documented one that you've probably all heard of is, of course, the western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis. Back when I was doing field work in Kananaskis, I found 4 of these. And, 3 years of censusing, or shouldn't say censusing, sampling for bees. I only found 4 when they used to be the single most abundant species found in Alberta. What was exciting for me was that right here in Turner Valley, I found a pretty healthy population. And so that was huge and so exciting. But again, I think the next summer, all of a sudden, my apple trees, which had always buzzed with bumblebees in the spring, took a whole different buzzing sound, and they were just flush with honeybees. And that was the last summer I saw western bumblebees in Turner Valley. And that's been the case ever since until last summer. And last summer was like a whole exciting new wonderful thing, except for, and of course the drought hit. So, but it started out well. So you can recognize the western bumblebee by the fact it has this all black abdomen and then this little white tip to it. So, and that's a bit different from the, I want to say moderatus, but it's now called, it's going to bug me, brain fart here, but it'll have a yellow band, then black, then white. And so you want to see if it's all black on the abdomen, then that's your western bumblebee.
So going back to your previous comment about 2 minutes ago, why would anybody want to commercially rear bumblebees?
Oh, because it's the same reason that you want commercially reared honeybees. I mean, there's designations. Suppose you have a crop, and depending on the size of your crop and what you're planting, there's advice on how many honeybee colonies you would want per acre and so on. And it's the same thing with some of our greenhouse plants where if you bring in commercially reared bumblebees, because they're tomato pollinators, for example, so that's one of the reasons you bring them in. So yeah, same with commercially reared leafcutter bees too. So yeah.
Right. Thanks.
Oh, you're welcome. Coupling in things like using pesticides. And it's not always about the use. So a lot of people I know, especially in landscaping and so on, would argue that, well, pesticides, they all fall under the name pesticides, but largely we're talking about things like herbicides. So 2,4-D and so on have they affect plant physiology, not animal. But whatever is in them, I mean, I would go for runs and along the roadside, I could pick up handfuls of bees, and I would, and it was very creepy. But now, so I just, taking my sons out, and we just stopped on the side of the road because I saw the sign, and I was like, pick up what you can, and I'll take a picture. And I mean, that was like a 30 seconds worth of a stop, and that's how many bees they picked up. And it's one thing if it's just workers. I don't mean just workers, but functionally, when you've killed a queen, you've killed the colony, right? Or certainly you've caused it to dispel, and maybe if you're lucky, you have a large worker that will take over as a queen. But it's a huge concern. Timing is everything as well. So certainly, if you're spraying at certain times of the spring, perhaps contamination of a plant that is heavily utilized by pollinators, this can lead to huge declines. I know there was an instance, I think it was like Germany or UK, where they had messed up in their treatment of seeds, and this actually led to the loss of tens of thousands of colonies of honeybees because they were foraging on this, and it killed them all, it destroyed them. And that they monitor honeybees, so they knew this. So what did that do to the native bees? I can only imagine it was just as catastrophic, if not worse. So yeah, if keeping bees doesn't save bees, then how do we bring them back? And this is kind of what I alluded to when I talked to folks in the fall, is just try to focus on the native bees. And if you love honey, then go visit Chinook Honey Farms. They're awesome, and they have the best honey ice cream on the planet, and they're super nice. But as far as what we should be doing in urban settings, it's not beekeeping. We really need to focus on our wild species. And what I have found is that the more time I spend watching, the more keen your eye gets and being able to tell, because some of them look just like flies, and you're like, how can I tell a fly, or that's a wasp or whatever. But you actually learn, you can tell from their flight, by the shape of their head, the shape of their eyes, their antennae and things, that you're actually looking at bees. And so anything you can do to nurture native bees and that diversity, for starters, we show this one all the time, but getting rid of the notion that this is favorable to this. So having a perfectly manicured lawn is fine if you're playing soccer or rugby, but if you're not doing that on your lawn, then it should look like this. You want to have as many flowering plants as you can, and actually I should be embarrassed because a lot of these that I have here are native species, but this is an older picture and I've since replaced things that weren't native with native. But regardless, this created ample nesting habitat and flowering resources. And there was never a time when I couldn't walk out and just listen to nonstop buzzing, as well as tons of other native pollinators and ladybugs and other beneficial insects. So, the big take home as far as creating habitat for native bees, I don't think I'm going to tell you anything you probably don't already know or haven't already heard, but planting those native plants is crucial. And the more native plants you can have, the better. Big thing is to make sure that you're planting not just, oh, I have this huge patch of whatever geranium or something, but you want to have flowers that you have something from right from the get-go in the springtime, like male willows, which you probably don't want near your house, but or water lines, or something more like, say, kinnikinnick and crocuses. And even our weeds like our dandelions in the spring, they're something that are of value to native pollinators. But then as you move on through the summer, what's the next native crop that we could have, and what's the next native crop, and right through into the fall. One of the resources you'll find on the Alberta Native Bee Council page is sort of the top 12 flower winners. And I highlight this because you can go on the internet and you can type in flowers for pollinators or plants for pollinators, and you'll get a bazillion resources, but they're not specific to Alberta. So what good is a resource list that's in a totally different ecozone? So having this resource, and this was generated again by Megan Evans, is phenomenal. Like, these are your top 12 plants. If you can plant even just a few of these, you're doing a huge service for your native bees. Right? And then, of course, it goes even further than this, and this is sort of that mind-blowing thing. But if you're actually thinking, okay, well, what can I plant so that it's ready in April? What's in May? What's in June? What's in July? What's in August? These are lists that are provided on the Bee Council page as well that go through all of these native plants that you could put in such that you'd have an endless supply. The other thing you have to remember is that these plants are adapted to be here. So when it comes times of drought or untimely freezing and our July snowfalls and things, these are the things you won't need to replace. Whereas you go to Golden Acres and buy all your geraniums and petunias and stuff, and those are the things that you'll be replacing. So go with what's adapted to be here. And then, of course, the second best, or not second best, but along with providing habitat would certainly be providing nesting habitat. So I was on, Ginny had put a Facebook post up about this talk, and someone brought up the fact that, oh, well, why would I want to put nest boxes out? And there's a great question, super valid, because there certainly is evidence that putting out a nesting box could actually be a sink. It's a site for a predator to come in and take advantage of whatever colonies inside. But providing nesting habitat in general is huge, and it can be a diversity of nesting habitats, because these do become increasingly limited with urbanization. Maybe not if you're living on the edge of a green space or a natural area, or you have ample maybe rodent colonies, rodent holes around you. But if you're in an area where there's a lot of concrete, you have better uptake of any kind of artificial nesting materials you put out. And that does include these nest boxes. So I had 8 colonies this summer, and it was, I think, my best summer ever. But I've had summers where I've had no colonies too. And most people say, oh, I never had this box for years. I've never gotten anything. But it's kind of like, as soon as you get that one sort of bite, it does actually increase the chances that you'll have the queens that were produced from that colony. If they had a great time there that summer, they're going to come back the next summer, because there is evidence for this sort of coming back to their natal habitat to nest. And I've seeded a few colonies that way. So having increased sort of interesting topography in your yard, where you've got these little edges that solitary bees can burrow into, little wetlands and so on, if you had little ponds, And then letting grasses grow. So there's a huge link where there's agricultural activities and the loss of hedgerows and things, but also just having all that short grass around them. And that short grass has been found to really cause declines in native bee abundance. And so having areas that you just let completely naturalize and let the grass grow and slump, this allows for surface nests to occur, which otherwise couldn't. And even having bare patches of soil, maybe mix in some sand so it's well drained. But given the fact that we talked about 98% of these species being solitary or nesting in the ground, certainly having bare patches of soil provides ample habitat for those types of native bees. Hollow stem nesters. So a lot of people that, put in leaf cutter nest boxes or even some of these bee hotels where they're like massive things, you want to be really careful about the design of those. And so again, the Alberta Native Bee Council has a brochure you can look at in their resources about best solitary bee or bee hotel practices, because you don't want to be, I would say 99, if not 100% of what you see as commercial products in the stores, and that includes Costco and Rona and PV Mart, all these little boxes with chicken wire and pieces of wood that are this long or open on both ends and such. They're garbage, right? You want something that's about good 6 inches deep. The back is sealed so that you don't have something coming in on the other side. And you don't want to have a huge thing, right? So as soon as you create some massive dwelling, these massive bee hotels, there is evidence that now you've basically created a buffet table for predators and predaceous wasps and other opportunists to come in and have a smorgasbord of native bees. So keeping it small is actually ideal and better from a conservation standpoint. So. Certainly just taking the time to learn about your native bees and why they're so awesome. I show this picture all the time because it was one of those things that I found so mind-blowing to some extent. And this is out of the Bees in Your Backyard. It's my favorite native bee resource. But the thing is that it's not specific to Alberta, right? So if you don't know exactly where these bees are, you can get lost in trying to figure out who's who in the bee zoo. And so, this is really neat because it shows you, here's some examples of wasp species, and they kind of have that weird sort of hammerhead shape to them. But then you've got these bees that are trying to, trying personification, but they're mimicking these wasps. Now wasps we know are carnivorous, right? Whereas bees are nectivores. They forage on nectar and pollen with very few exceptions. And so because they're non-aggressive, certainly maybe by mimicking wasps, it's like putting on the leather jacket, right? But then we go to the flies that are trying to mimic the bees and the wasps so that they just don't get eaten by whatever. And so it's just this neat, from an evolutionary standpoint, it's really quite amazing to see these commonalities between these species. And I remember my first field season out in Kananaskis, and I would be chasing these big hairy, what I thought were bees all over, watching them because that's what I was supposed to be doing. And then they go landing in big piles of cow, the big cow pies in the forest, and I'd know that I had been duped by a bumblebee mimic. And those mimics are so specific that they'll actually still, even though they're these flies, but they'll have striped patterns, the variations that would match the different bumblebee species we have here in Alberta. So it's very clever. Well played. And if you look at some of the sort of leading experts like Lawrence Packer, another amazing bombologist, he wrote a book called Keeping Bees. This is all about, again, keeping native species and bumblebees. But in the first edition that came out, the editors actually put a bee mimic on the front. So this is, it wasn't a bee at all. It was actually a fly. And I think that also happened with the Bees of the World, which is like a massive book where they put a bee mimic on it. So as far as learning about which species we actually have here in Alberta, we have this incredible resource by Betty Beswick. And I mean, this is the most amazing thing ever, but you can actually check this out, and it describes every single species of sweat bee or, leaf cutter bees and so on that you would find here within Alberta. And then you can try to find appropriate imaging to go with that. So it's an incredible resource, and we're very lucky to have somebody like that. And then I had an abundance of really cool YouTube videos, but I might have to change and be showing you those instead of this. So I'll come back to that because I, again, mostly just wanted to get you excited about bees. So I'll finish this off. So again, there's a number of different types of things you'll see on the internet, and they're of equal or sort of varying degrees of good or bad. So super bad, moderately bad. But here's a bumblebee nesting box. This is a little colony inside of it, and those colony sizes will vary with the species you have. So if you have something like a Bombus mixtus or frigidus, they have very tiny colonies. You might only have 10 or 15 cells, whereas if you have something like, I had, I think, 3 or 4 nevadensis colonies this summer, you have these massive colonies. And so it just depends on the species as far as sort of the typical colony size. But that also dictates how susceptible each of these species are to the different things that are stressing their population. So bees that are less sort of fecund, that produce smaller colonies just intrinsically, are far more susceptible to becoming rare when there's stressors to their populations than ones that can produce rapidly, so, or massively. Here's some different examples of some of my bumblebee colonies. And so all this stuff you see on the outside, that's bee poop, or at least in this example on the right. And so that's how I could gauge how big my colonies were. It's always neat to see a little worker bee in the window. Those were the guard bees that would use their antennae to sort of sniff out incoming workers to make sure they were sisters. This was an interesting case because in this case, this is actually pollen, and the bees were coming and spitting the pollen out. And I have videos of this, I just didn't post them. So I can only guess that it was contaminated with something because I've never seen anything like that before. So again, the more time you spend watching these guys, that it's amazing, right? I also did things a little crazy this summer where I was taking these hollow logs or I'd hollow them out if they were rotten, and I'd turn them into bee houses. So I'd put boards on the bottom, it's kind of screw in one little spot, and so I could pop them on and off. And I had incredible uptake because in nature, this is what they'd be looking for is, oh, there's a log with a hole in it, or, probably maybe remnant odors from other cavity nesting organisms that had been in there before. So they were, really attracted to this. I had a nevadensis colony in this log in particular. This other one, I had another nevadensis colony, and I also had a vegans colony. So they really liked those. So I mean, the biggest thing, like I said, is promoting having these types of habitats, but certainly just educating yourselves and not maybe buying into, there's so much of the greenwashing or the green initiative or the sort of bee washing initiative that's going on right now, which is really difficult to navigate. So it's really just things that we can do to focus on these native species and step away from some of these activities where the jury is still out on what effects they're having on native populations. And take that with a grain of salt because, there's a zillion different factors that would come into play as far as how adversely commercially reared bees might affect native species. If you had a habitat that was utopia, perhaps you're keeping honeybees, but you've turned your entire yard or land into nothing but flowering plants, well, then you've really diminished any harmful effects in terms of foraging and competition for resources. But if it's a case where you're bringing in a colony and you're putting it on your balcony because you live in an apartment complex, then that's a whole nother ball of wax. So I'm going to go back to my little page of videos. I just wanted to show you a few because I really did want to. Do I still have time, Ginny?
Oh yeah, you're good.
I just really wanted to be able to show you some of these neat things that I got to see this summer Although I guess I'll have to. Oh, yeah. Hang on. I wanted to be able to show the YouTube, but I guess unless I open it, I can't show it to you. So 1 second.
No worries.
All right, so pause this. So this was one of the first things I saw this summer, or spring, I should say. And it was, I had no choice but to dig out my mother's yard because she had this horrific ant problem. This was in, I want to say, very beginning of April. So I didn't practice what I preach, but it was really a problem for her because she couldn't even stand in her yard without being swarmed. So I had to do some digging. At any rate, there's a lot of literature that says that bumblebees nest deep in rodent holes and so on. And I don't think I had cleared 2 inches of leaves and so on, and I started finding queens. So there's a native, a bumblebee queen. I think that was Bombus vegans. But then I also found bald-faced hornet queens. Hopefully you guys can see this. I guess Jenny will tell me if you can.
Yeah, no, it looks great. That's amazing.
And then I also found there was also a few yellow jacket queens in there. So literally within a few inches of each other, I had all of these queens just nesting together. And I found that amazing because I've never seen anything in the literature about that. So that was kind of one of those mind-blowing things. The next thing that I see every single year, and I noticed this while barbecuing, is these beautiful green bees, and I sent the best images I could get of them to Lincoln Best again, because he knows everything bees. Oh, that's not a good video. I'll put a better link on what you post, Ginny, but just these beautiful, yeah, they look like emeralds, flying emeralds, in my drain, and or in the dryer vent. And what I found was that on June 24th of every spring, I get these bees popping out. So it's so well timed that it's just amazing. Right now, this is my little friend, which I named One Wing. And I named her One Wing because she only had 1 wing, as I found out. And here, this is the first time I found her. She was just kind of on the lawn and seemed pretty messed up. And so she was kind of scared of me, and she'd flip on her back and pretend like she was going to sting me. And when I finally did manage to convince her that I wasn't going to hurt her, then she'd sit in my hand. So I went and got her some sugar water to try and feed her. And after that day, because there's a lot of evidence that they just have incredible memories, and especially when it comes to foraging, she crawled across the lawn for 7 days in a row, and would sit and drink in my hand. Like, that's amazing, right? Like,
that's incredible.
Yes, I have timestamp videos to prove this. But and then what I'd do is I'd carry her around to all my different colony boxes because I wasn't sure which one she came out of until I found the one that she wanted to go back into, and then she'd just pop into it. And if you took her to the wrong box, she wouldn't go in, right? So it's really pretty amazing. But yeah, every day she'd come out and she'd kind of crawl up onto my foot or something. One time I didn't even notice her there, and I think I kicked her, but it's kind of just a really neat experience. I don't know if I would have gotten hadn't it been for all the crazy COVID stuff. This was another bee. I mean, the number of bees I had to walk around my yard to take them home, but this was a Nevadensis queen. She was a newer queen. She got stuck in a hole in the soil. She was cranky, so that's why I had to use a knife. I knew she'd sting me. But then, so I got her out, but then I had to still try to find where she actually lived. So I took her to the different nests we had in the yard. I knew that this log was full of Nevada bumblebees, and I thought, well, she's closest to it, so she must live here. But kind of funny. I'll turn this down. She gets really mad at me here. I'm like, go in. She's like, no. So she was not going to go into that, and it's a huge colony, so it's probably good she didn't, because she might have got beat up. She fell. And So then I had to figure out, well, where do you live? So I thought about where my other Nevada bumblebee colonies were. So hoofed her across the lawn and realized I'm a real mouth breather. And found the colony that she did live in, and the reaction is so different. Like as soon as she was at the right hole, it was just like, oh yeah, I'll see you later. You know, like just right in there. It's just amazing to me.
That is incredible.
I know, right? So, I mean, and again, it's just from watching these guys. This is a strange thing. So there was a lot of leave that.
Perfect. Oh, that sounds good.
All right, there you go.
Wonderful.
Sorry for the interlude, musical interlude, and it spoiled watching bee mating, but oh well.
Oh, that's too bad, right?
The cool thing, or the strange thing, and then again, because I watch bees, I spend hundreds of hours, thousands of hours every summer, and but this was two different species, and it was a small male flavifrons that had pounced on a huge female nevadensis, and so I've never seen that. I also witnessed that I had so many instances where my bumblebee colonies at the very end, when I went to harvest the contents, wasps had come in and were just taking any nectar or any honey or wax that they could eat. So you know, it sort of told me that they were very hungry and resources were limited. My colonies in the front yard, which are normally 100 or more, they died within the beginning of summer, so I think I had maybe 20 cells in those. I actually watched a wasp take out a bumblebee, and I've never seen that. Like this poor little worker was on a flower, and this wasp came flying down and just boom, like slap, and then they were rolling across the lawn and battling, and my mind was blown. I mean, these are things that I have never seen before.
Wow.
Yeah, so interesting. But still, it's amazing to watch all these things going on. So
That's great.
yeah.
Oh, that was good. You know, every session we do with you, I always learn something new. Thank you. It's really fun.
I'm still thrown off by the whole music interlude.
The interlude was lovely. It was lovely.
Heavy metal, but
Right? It could have been worse. So I'll just end this now then with just a big thank you. Thank you so much, Lexi, for teaching us tonight, and thank you for everyone else for joining us this evening. For everyone who's going to be joining us to build a bumblebee nest box, I pasted a link in the chat for the Zoom meeting. So you can log out of the webinar and then log into that. It's just so that we can see each other and interact a lot more as we're building the nest boxes. And for everyone else, if you'd like to build your own nest box over the winter or the spring, there are directions on the Alberta Native Bee Council website. So on that note, everyone have a lovely evening, and thanks again for joining us.